Good evening, people. My name is Qwizical, and I'm here to bring you another installment of Qwizical's Guides to, and today we are looking at setup plays. Firstly, I'm going to show you what a typical setup play would look like. This is just based on my experience, particularly of lower divisions. And secondly, I'll show you an example of a setup play that actually happened in a game that I annotated at the BMSC this year. But firstly, what is a setup play? A setup play is something, it's a particular play that aims to set up a particular tile you have. Usually it's a case tile, so by case tile we mean it's the last one of its lettering in the bag. So for example, you might set up your final S, and that's usually for me, that's usually to gain some kind of scoring advantage. You usually have to sacrifice points to make up a setup play, but the rewards of doing it can be wonderful. So let's check out the first game that I have set up. So this is just something I set up for fun, she says. So here the kind of setup play you want to do where you will typically find setup plays is along the triple lines, because the triple lines are where your score gets maximized, and maximizing score is almost what setup plays are all about. Usually they'll either set up for bonuses or they'll set up for humongous scores, and to be fair, they're almost the same thing, aren't they? So the N is basically where we're focusing our plays here, but we can also focus our plays on these two triples here at A1 and H1. Now, what's particularly bad about a setup play, for example, like Ale or Lee, if I use those two examples, is they're really easy for your opponent to still use. What you've always got to consider when you're making your setup plays is the hooks that the words take. So if you don't know all of the hooks a word takes, and the types of words that will usually go into setup plays are normally 3 or 4 letter words that end up getting made or hooked onto, and those are the kind of words that a lot of players will know the hooks to. So something like Lee is really bad because it doesn't just take an A in front, it takes a B, it takes a G, and those are still unseen from our point of view in this particular example, so that's really, really bad. The same thing goes with a play like Lay. That will also take not just your case S in front, but it also takes, for example, the P. And knowing that your opponent still could utilize your idea of a setup like this, you're not going to play something particularly like this, because if your opponent's going to take the setup you've made, then it's not a good setup. But the N here is a particularly useful place to do a setup. So a play such as Nay, its only end hook is an S, and that's particularly good because your opponent is then not able to use this setup themselves. They then are forced to think about whether it's necessary to block the setup or not. Now, of course, setups don't normally only use your S. Setups can also be used for other tiles as well. So, for example, a play like Anil not only sets up your S, but it also sets up your E. So in the event that maybe you draw, say, the W or the V, and maximizing those tiles may come best to put the E here. And it's always something to consider what other letters your play hooks onto, because it may allow for easier scoring. Something like the Anil setup. Maybe if you don't draw bonus next turn, or your play gets somewhat restricted by a blocking play, then you've got the opportunity to play something else and not be forced to burn the case S, case S is a really, really useful usually. Except on boards where they're not really S friendly. So here, if I was setting up, I would probably play something like Anil. But of course, as you can see, Anil only scores 4 points. And like with the other players, Ale would score 3, Lay scores 6. Even though those two aren't good players, you're destroying the opportunity of scoring on this board, and you need to weigh up whether it's worth playing a move that sets up your plays if it's going to score basically less than 10 points, and your opponent may just easily block it. So you always have to consider whether it's a necessity to play these setup plays. Now, sometimes you may find these setup plays where you're actually in a situation where you need to create a setup for your case tile to have a chance at winning, because your opponent, will be forced to block it, and there's somewhere else on the board maybe you can play in. There's just so many things to consider. Like, each situation is so unique that you have to learn when to make these setup plays, and you have to learn whether it's right or not. And there's just so many things to think about. So here's the second example. This actually happened at the BMSC in a game between Alan Simmons and Sue Tremblay. And as you probably saw, Alan played the word Todd here. Played Todd for 18 points. And he also had the option to play they. Oh, well, now I've done the simulation. I've done over 3,000 iterations, and Todd comes out best by 3%. So we're not arguing that this video. But what we are going to talk about is Alan's play of Todd, and what makes it so interesting and useful as a setup. Because Alan set up Todd with his case H. Pronounced H. There's no H at the beginning of H. Pet hate of mine. But what makes Todd so interesting is that in order for Sue to block it, she's going to have to make some kind of play at 06, 07, maybe something like RAR. But she'd basically only be scoring about 14 points. And it's not, it's not worth it for Sue to block it. Even though a play like Todd, Sue knows that Alan's going to be holding the H. But Alan's then forced his opponent to make up a choice as to whether blocking it is better than leaving it alone. And that's always something that setup players force into the mind of your opponent. Your opponent then has to think, right, is blocking it the best thing, or is maybe leaving it alone the best thing, or what do I do with a setup? And it's something that blockable setups do. Not all setups are gonna be blockable. Sometimes you'll have a setup that isn't blockable. And if you do, that's really, really, really lucky. But what Alan probably weighed up here is his risk of playing Todd and sacrificing an extra 12 points for a play of they, and the reward he would get, provided that Sue left it alone, would be a potentially humongous H play down column O. Now, of course, the H scores 4 points. H both ways is 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. He's almost guaranteed 40 points just from this setup. Now, of course, he sacrificed 12 to get the setup, so you could argue that it's potentially, sacrifice 12 points to maybe get, like, an extra 12, 20 maybe? I mean, who knows? But the idea behind the setup is to score more points. And also with this board, the way that it was, the setup, it's a major scoring hotspot on this board, and without there being one on this board, it's a pretty big place to play, and it's really profitable. You could argue it's a necessity on this board because of the lack of other scoring opportunities, but at the same time, this is one of those both-way plays, but it's a really interesting setup that was decided and chosen by Alan, and I think it's something to always consider, whether you can make a setup or whether you can't. Now, of course, here dot doesn't work because there are 4 A's remaining unseen. So placing the D at 8N is just so much better. So in summary, we've got point number 1, the weigh up of the risk and the reward of your setup play. Is it worth playing your setup play? And are you going to get much back from it? So the idea behind it is your setup plays normally are going to get you more points than any other option available to you. So is it worth making the setup to sacrifice points in order to get those more points, those additional points? I not grammar today. Point number 2, blockability. Once you've considered your potential setup, how easy is it going to be for your opponent to block it? Or if you're that opponent, how easy is it going to be for you to block it? There are loads of different ways to block plays. I find that creating many potential parallel plays reduces the chance of a big play coming, and that's because when you try and make parallels, you've got to have certain letters in certain positions, and it makes it really hard to then completely maximize what's coming next. But also, if you're playing your setup, is it going to be really easy to block? You don't want to make your setup and then find your opponent's just like completely blocked it off with C's and V's, and then you're just like, well, now the setup only gets me 20 points, so was it worth it to make that setup in the first place? Maybe not. Third point, is it a necessity to play that setup? There may be other places on the board you've overlooked, maybe other setups you've even overlooked. Always consider all your options before you decide on a setup, and that's pretty much standard for all moves. But you really need to think about whether these particular kinds of moves are worth it to win the game or to maximize your spread. And the fourth point, the final point, which is something that is really important, does your setup have other hooks? And this is something you really need to consider, because you don't want your opponent to take that setup. So if you've forgotten, say, that a word has taken a front hook A as well as a front hook B, then you've kind of just ruined all your chances there. So it's really important to know your shorter words in order to make the most of any hooks on the board, as well as any potential setups that you may devise later in the game. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learnt something. I'm not sure what the next installment of the video will be, but stay tuned for this series and I will have more content for you in future.